Welcome to this week's installment of Stat Plus Conversations, a weekly video chat series exclusively for Stat Plus subscribers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rick Burke, the co-founder and executive editor of Stat. And just a few moments, I'll be joined by Pharmalot's Ed Silverman to chat about the current state of the pharmaceutical industry. But first, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourself or send a message directly to the Stat team. Please note, we will not be taking questions directly from that chat feature rather. But we will, if you would like to have a question, we will be taking them, but please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to type your question over to us and we'll answer it live or try to answer it live. You'll also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions that you'd like most to have answered. Feel free to ask us about anything, to put Ed on the spot. That's fine as long as you don't put me on the spot at any point throughout the conversation. With that, I'd like to introduce the man that I call Mr. Pharmalot, Ed Silverman, our senior writer and Pharmalot columnist at Stat. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, Rick.
We have so much to talk about, Ed, but first, for those of you who are loyal Pharmalot readers, they know about your mascot. And can we have a little introduction of your mascot? And
give me 1 second.
Okay. I hope you all know what's coming.
Bailey, say hi.
How old?
He's 5 months old and growing. Okay.
And is your mascot by your side as you're writing Pharmalot and Pharmalot?
Sometimes. He's still young and full of energy, so he doesn't quite have as much patience as my two former mascots did. They would curl under my legs.
And why is it that you always talk about your mascots?
Well, it's part of it's just part of the gestalt I have when I write my little Pharmalot newsletter each morning, because I discovered when I first started this that it was a nice way to ease the day. All the other newsletters that I saw were very serious and just not dry necessarily, but you know, you got hit in the face with whatever the information was, which is fine. But I thought if I took just a moment to write 3 or 4 sentences, it would humanize it, maybe form a little bond, get people to relate, because you know we're all human.
Right. And you're an institution and staff. You joined us when we launched about 5 years ago, but before that, you've been in something of an institution in pharma reporting. You were one of the first aggressive pharma reporters out there. Can you tell everyone, for those of you who don't know, how long you've been in this racket?
Covering pharma, only 25 years.
And how did you come by the name Pharmalot?
Well, candidly, I'd been working at the Star Ledger of New Jersey for a little more than a decade. A call went out to start up new websites, and I raised my hand and suggested something about the pharma industry. And after marinating a bit, we decided to start a blog, and there was a contest to come up with a name. I lost. Someone on the copy desk at 11 o'clock at night, I was told, came up with the name Pharmalot because the editor at the paper was a big Camelot fan.
And what was your name, your suggestion?
Farmer's Market.
Oh, our readers, we should.
That's why I lost.
To vote that down. If anyone wants to vote that up or down in the chat, you're welcome to. So anyway, let me dive into some actual news here. And there's a lot I want to discuss with you about COVID, but before we do that, you had a big exclusive yesterday where you broke the story that several big drug makers on 3 continents next month are going to be announcing creation of a new $1 billion for-profit venture to acquire or invest in small antibiotic companies. And this comes that there's been a discussion of the dearth of antibiotics out there. Can you explain sort of how meaningful this is, how important you think this is?
Well, if it takes off as described, and of course there's some nuances and details to flesh out, but if it takes off, it has the potential to be a big game changer because big pharma has largely been absent in this market for quite a while. And despite the obvious recognition that we need new novel antibiotics to fight off superbugs, as they're called, we just don't have enough incentives, and in the US, particularly the right reimbursement structure to attract the larger companies to invest. And so by finding this pathway, it brings them back into the tent. You open up the tent and they're nosing in. The details are going to be announced to a larger extent in a few days, but basically it would give them a chance, the big drug makers give them a chance to perhaps acquire a smaller company or acquire a particular product or work on licensing and commercialization deals, all of the above. And each of the big companies have an ownership stake. And again, those are among the details that have to get worked out, how some of this gets sorted for each company. But in terms of the societal and public health value, it creates a lot more momentum and a lot more potential enthusiasm, because otherwise we're just left with smaller companies that don't have enough capital to either go the distance and get the product out the door, or if they do, then get reimbursed properly. Again, that's a big issue in the United States. So this could make a difference.
Now, Ed, these are big drug companies that are very competitive. How do they, is it unusual for them to be working together like on something like this? And how were they brought together? Do you know?
Well, I know some of it, not as much as I'd like, but it's not entirely unusual. I mean, there is a joint venture for HIV. It's largely owned by Glaxo, but a couple other companies have a piece. So, there is that sort of framework to look at, for instance. I think there's been talk certainly for years. It's not as if the large companies aren't aware and haven't been approached over time. A few years ago, a former Goldman Sachs fellow named Jim O'Neill was commissioned by the UK government to come up with a plan, and he proposed at some point a reward system, for instance. So there's been lots of efforts to dangle carrots in front of big pharma. None of them have really taken hold. And I think the for-profit incentive is probably the most obvious compared to a reward system that they can relate to.
It seems like profits has probably been a theme of your coverage for many years. Speaking of profits and pricing, let's jump to Gilead's announcement yesterday about the pricing of remdesivir. Was the price they announced higher or lower than you would have expected as a veteran reporter covering this kind of thing?
Well, it was pretty much in the ballpark, and I realize that sounds like I'm fudging it, but
it does, Ed.
But I'll get to that though. I do read the Wall Street analyst reports. There's one guy at Leerink who'd been writing a series of reports, and he interviewed the Gilead CFO, and he came up with a figure, a range, and ICER, the cost effectiveness watchdog, the self-appointed nonprofit, had a range. I talked to a couple of folks who are, let's say, familiar with Gilead thinking, And I didn't have anything definitive, or I would have written it, but they tried to get me to think about, a price at the lower end of the range that was being publicly discussed up until yesterday. And that came close to what we were hearing from ICER and also what it turned out to be. So the short answer is I'm not all that surprised. I would have been surprised if it was, more than 5,000 or 10,000. I would have been surprised if it was, under 500, in terms of a treatment course as opposed to one vial.
Let me ask you a question that's popped up from Brian Jackson, who said, do you think Gilead's pricing will reframe corporate goals of drug pricing from overall profit maximization to something that incorporates social benefit?
Well, I'll have to fudge again, and I would say maybe, because certainly this introduces the idea in a way that has only been theoretical or largely theoretical until now. So it's great to have this example. It's a little hard to know. We're in a pandemic, which makes it unusual as opposed to a specific disease state that affects a set number of people, let's say, a percentage of the population. Of course, anyone's potentially susceptible or potentially in a position to develop a widespread disease, but it's sort of an unusual moment in time. I do think it has the potential to shape thinking. I don't know. It's hard for me to answer. Is it going to really filter down to the point where many and eventually most drugs are seen through this kind of prism when the pricing is set? There's the traditional push and pull, the yin and yang between anyone with scruples who says, let's do what's right for society, and making a profit, which is our fiduciary responsibility. So this could inject a whole new level of thinking. I just hesitate to say it's going to mark a watershed change anytime soon.
Do you think there's you're talking about sort of how the companies will act. How about sort of reputationally? Do you think it is possible indeed for the image of pharma to change from what it is? And I guess I'd first ask you, what do you think the image of pharma is now in general? And I'd start with that. I don't want to assume anything.
I think right now the image is in the tank and it's floating or dropping toward the bottom of the tank because of all the years of pricing angst and the just inability of a growing number of people to say, and well, let's take them at their word, they're having trouble affording this or that medicine. And that hasn't really changed. I think the pandemic, and we'll see over time because it's still only 4 months or so out from when it hit the US and 6 months from other places. I think it's possible for some people the image will change in a positive direction, because it is true we do need science and innovation to get where as far out of this mess as we can. But there's an underlying anxiety, if you will, that I detect, and that's putting it mildly, among a lot of people, because to answer your second question, my answer is never say never. The image, reputation rather, could and it should change, but it should do so for the right reasons. The other reaction, or one reaction yesterday to Gilead's remdesivir pricing was, well, this company is charging thousands. It's a few thousand for a 5-day treatment course. And what's a lot to one person is relative to what's a lot to another. But part of the argument I've heard, and this is not as of yesterday, it's going on for weeks, is that, well, if Gilead had government help in the form of government agency scientists who worked with the company in early stages of discovery, even if that contributed toward the ultimate end product that they can market for a profit, well, should the government get a royalty? Because there's an issue of patents, not to get too wonky, but if the government, if CDC scientists helped out should the CDC have a patent right? And if so, maybe there's a royalty. And those royalties, those dollars can add up and float back to the government for legitimately useful purposes. So that tension is still there. And that type of issue with the behind the scenes wonkiness of patents and royalties and discovery, that is actually been bubbling up for a while with other drugs. And I think it's going to continue to be an issue more and more, reflecting the higher prices or larger complaints about higher prices for all sorts of medicines. So that, circling back to reputation, that hinders the industry's ability to rectify its reputation if it isn't more forthcoming about the patent situation. And look, again, fiduciary responsibility. They've got an obligation to protect their profits if someone's going to come after their patents and revenues. But I do think that there should be more disclosure and more discussion so that if industry's smart, they'll talk about it more and be more open about it and show folks their patents and show folks what they have or haven't done. Because this will hinder all the talk about pandemic products, not just remdesivir.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see your role as a reporter covering the industry and what because I wonder sometimes if people that you cover understand what you're trying to do and why you ask sometimes tough questions, why you want more transparency. Can you just talk a little bit how you view your role?
Well, I kind of look at the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, it's an industry as a concept. But when I started covering this 25 years ago and I started learning all these things, to an extent, every story is an interim story. But what's the larger tale? And the one thing I noticed early on with the pharmaceutical industry, and it's really true of everything, but there was constant change, sometimes faster than other moments, sometimes for different, more important or significant reasons than other times, but it was constantly undergoing evolution. And I thought, what's the best way, or what's a good way? What is one good way of telling that change, those tales? And I quickly noticed that what I call points of tension reflect the change. There's angst about an R&D decision. Maybe it's leaving a therapeutic category. Maybe it's litigation. Maybe it's legislation. Maybe it's a payer dispute. All these things signify to me that there is some kind of change going on, for better or worse, but there's some kind of change going on involving discovery, marketing, regulation, pricing, whatever, and that helps, if you pull them all together, tell the larger tale. So I look at, as I said a moment ago, those points of tension, because they help, I think, illuminate what's going on and why. So as a result of focusing in that approach or that direction, I'm looking for what some people might interpret as controversy, but it's not for the sake of it. It's because
Right.
The underlying message is there's something going on here. It's not static, and it's going to affect lots of people in different ways.
There's a bunch of questions still about Gilead, so let me just get in a couple more. Frank Condella is asking, there is list price and net price. What do you think Gilead will keep? What do you think Gilead will keep net price close to net? That is,
Remdesivir?
Gilead will keep net price close to net. That is no rebate structure.
What do I think the chances are? It's a good question. I don't know. Might be easier to bet the outcome of the election in November. I'll take an educated guess and say that given the fact that Gilead has a new regime, they've got a new CEO as of a year and a half ago. It comes from a much bigger pharma company. A lot of overhaul at the top. You know, for all we know, they're trying to dress the company up for sale. But that aside, I do think that Daniel O'Day, the CEO at Gilead, is trying in ways completely different from the previous CEOs to get in front of the discussion. For better or worse, anyone can make a judgment whether he's succeeding, but I do think he's trying to get in front of the discussion. Having said that, and having watch the very calculated moves, I would think they'd be smart enough at that company not to dress up their image with all these CEO letters they've been issuing and talk about value and trying to explain how concerned they are with access, and then somehow play games behind the scenes that mess up the cost equation so that consumers who with a pandemic drug are desperate for a life-saving drug, or in a pandemic are desperate for a life-saving drug, and make it harder for them to afford the medicine. So my short answer, after being long-winded, is that I'd be surprised if they kind of step in it.
And let me, Norman Smith is asking, wouldn't the biggest impact be on other new products to treat COVID? How about the pricing for inline products found to be effective for COVID-19?
The impact?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it goes, in part, it goes back to what we were discussing before about whether this changes, if not philosophy, just sort of a mindfulness about, or an awareness about what other companies should be charging for their products. I'm not sure I'm answering this question, but I'm not sure exactly how else to answer it right now.
Let's jump to vaccines. And there's a question about the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and what your thoughts are about what they're doing, and the fact that this is from Martin Murphy, the fact that the administration has chosen not to support this global initiative that is having global impact on vaccine development by pharma and biotech.
Well, I'm not a CEPI critic per se. I mean, there are people at different advocacy groups that, and sometimes rightfully so, will make a point of criticizing this or that nonprofit or public-private partnership for a legitimate reason. But as far as the second part of the question, I mean, I think CEPI's trying to do good. The administration decision not to join, stupid.
Yeah. And what do you think's driving that?
Well, there's someone sitting in the Oval Office who doesn't seem to be convinced of the utility of cooperation with allies and looking beyond whatever, it's like failing to see the forest for the trees. At the end of the day, we're all in the same boat, and the inability to acknowledge that and act on it is a failing. I realize I'm talking in broad strokes, and some people might say I'm being too political and or unfair, but that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. How do you balance in such a political time for our country, where your coverage is very science-based, fact-based, and rigorous? How do you balance, but given the state of the world right now and how a lot of these decisions have become so politicized in how we handle and respond to COVID, how do you protect yourself from looking like you're taking some kind of political, having any kind of political bent when you cover this?
Well, as you know, and maybe some readers know, besides just doing what I do, I also write an opinion column sometimes. Some folks call it an op-ed. I sort of take off my usual journalist hat and put on my columnist hat. And this happened earlier this year with hydroxychloroquine. When I write a column and I express my own opinion, I realize I'm putting myself in a funny spot, because then I'm going to go back and put on my journalist hat and maybe cover the same stuff again. So how do I strike that balance as best I can with some degree of transparency and integrity? Well, I just won't riff for 300 words and say, oh, this is a dumb idea, or I love this idea. What I try to do is incorporate an element of what I think of as news analysis, by which I mean I'll do research, I'll do reporting, I'll talk to folks, I'll quote them if I think it's helpful, even though it's my opinion. It's not necessarily to validate my opinion, it's to back up the claim I'm making. And I did that with hydroxychloroquine. I talked to the guy who heads ER at University Hospital in Newark, New Jersey, a pulmonologist at 2 different hospitals, staff pulmonologist at 2 different hospitals in Connecticut, in Waterbury, Connecticut, about hydroxychloroquine. What were they seeing? What were they looking at? In this case, it wasn't just what I was hearing from a couple of docs on the front lines. It was also an issue of data, because at the end of the day, numbers matter, and that Wall Street will tell you the same thing about any number of numbers or any kind of numbers. And so, yeah, I have an opinion, but I'll try to avoid taking a political tack for the sake of it. And I want to say, look, with hydroxychloroquine, as that example I mentioned, there's a reason we should hit the pause button. You know, we don't have this or that kind of data. We have experts who are trying to save lives in ERs right now saying that sort of thing. So you can attack me all you want for saying hydroxychloroquine shouldn't be used, and that means I must hate Trump. But the reality is, that's not how I started that morning.
Right.
And how I ended it that day. It was all about, in this case, data. I mean, I could write my own opinion about Trump, but that wasn't really what I was writing about.
Yeah. Got it. Let's go back as we're talking about vaccines. You've written a lot about access, and sort of is that the biggest question you have about as we look to vaccines, affordability, access, or what are your thoughts?
I think it applies to all medicines all the time, and just so folks might know, I have had family and relatives in the pharmaceutical industry. I work out of my house in suburban Jersey, and I've been in this house or this town for 17 years. Through kids, through activities, through happenstance, I know a ton of people who work or have worked in pharma on a personal level. So I hear their side of the story. I benefit from the tax dollars flowing from the pharma industry into the state of New Jersey, such as they are. My kids get vaccinated or have, they're older. We take prescription medicines. I had a grandfather who was a pharmacist in Bensonhurst his whole life. So I hear different, and I've lived different perspectives. So anyone who might think because I care about access and I only see profit versus patient or patent, that's too simplistic. And I realize there's no way of knowing that from reading my stories. But since you asked, I'll take the opportunity to say that I talk about access because, like it or not, we're in a moment in time where, yes, there's more in it. Let's take the US. There's more income inequality. We have a difficult, complicated, sometimes inaccessible healthcare system that does make it hard for some people to get the medicines they need through no fault of their own. And it's not just the pharmaceutical company that is an issue or an element to the conversation. So, but access affects everything. It's vaccines, it's every treatment, and it's increasingly a problem around the world because I write stories about lawmakers and government ministers in Asia, Latin America, Europe, contacting me sometimes or responding to my questions at times, saying some of the same things I'm hearing from residents in the United States who aren't lawmakers or politicians. There's a common theme that's spreading around the globe, not unlike a pandemic. And it's unfortunate because whether you want to argue that health is a right or not, we all want to be healthy and improve our health when we have the opportunity. And the access issue is an impediment. So I don't mean to be on a soapbox, but I try to see it in broad terms and humanize it so that people hopefully can relate to it.
Do you, what would you say generally is your expectation of, or your sense of a timeline with a vaccine?
Well, I don't know what Tony Fauci knows. I do worry, I'll preface it by saying I do worry that, you know, we could get, what's the expression, an October surprise? Suddenly there's a vaccine approved and November 3rd is how far away? That's really cynical and it's going to sound very political if you want, but you know, October surprises come up in the past, different administrations.
No matter Republican, Democrat.
Right. So, but putting the cynicism aside, there's just the science. And I'm not a vaccine expert. I talk to folks, I read, you know, we've had great stories, a lot of good stories about this whole issue and what to expect. I think just knowing what we know, the odds are that it can take and might well take longer than shorter. And here we are, it's almost July. And in the US, 4+ months have gone by, 5 months, whatever it is. And are we closer to a vaccine? I hope so. It certainly looks like we're making progress in different ways. But then there's, you know, the practical matter, you know, is a vaccine useful for enough of the population? How much can we make and how fast? Then we have to make decisions. Maybe, and this is going to get complicated, maybe the most vulnerable in the population should be vaccinated behind the younger people. Wait till that conversation comes up. That's going to be a doozy.
There was you had mentioned to me, we had in a recent stat story, an unnamed Trump administration official pledged that a future vaccine would be available for free to quote unquote vulnerable Americans unable to afford it. That you noted that quote to me. What stood out about that to you?
That was in the past month, and I thought I wasn't privy to that primary conversation. I wasn't on the phone that day to hear it. I read about it on our website, but it struck me as a trial balloon, a well-timed trial balloon, because Trump and his team were increasingly being criticized for their handling of the pandemic, and masks have been a topic, and they recently announced Operation Warp Speed to get a vaccine going ASAP. And then all of a sudden, this announcement comes. He's about to go to Tulsa for a rally. It's a talking point, but there was no substance behind it. How is that going to work? It seemed like they were really keen to suddenly make that statement, but what could they say more to back it up? And I didn't read anything anywhere to back up to say, well, how are you going to make that accessible to the most vulnerable people? What does that look like? How soon can, you know, all the usual mechanics. There was nothing about that.
There's one question from attendee. Will a COVID vaccine be approved by the FDA prior to phase 3 trials?
Well, I think the FDA is in the process now of issuing the guidance, which I haven't had a chance to go through or see much of what Steve Hahn has said this morning in Congress, but I suppose it's a possibility. But scientifically, and I'm not a scientist, by the way, I have a business background, folks. I studied accounting, if you can believe that. I would say we ought to be really careful.
Yeah. I have two similar questions that I'll summarize from Adam Silverstein and Cynthia Flora. Cynthia asks, can you speak to the effect of all the focus going to therapies and vaccines for COVID-19 on the already slow and thin research and development, research and treatment for rare disease groups, sucking interested dollars away, and what about the actual drugs themselves? And she goes on, but let me, related to that is Adam's question is, what are the companies you cover saying about their long-term thinking on drug development for disorders that aren't COVID-19? Are they pausing, moving ahead? So both questioners want to know about the impact of non-COVID on non-COVID diseases.
Yeah, it's all about allocating resources. I think that, I think money talks. I think that any company that already has a nascent pipeline, a staff, facilities, agreements, whether it's with the CRO or it's licensed from a product from biotech, they're all going to say, we've invested this much. It's a hot therapeutic category. There's still going to be demand for this. The healthcare system might be burdened. Certain people may not be in a position to get treatment. Maybe hospitals fail. Insurance is, for some people, is gone or costs more. but there's still going to be demand for treatments for certain therapeutic categories. And when I said money talks, those where the reimbursement is at a high enough rate that to meet their financial goals. So I do think that it's not going to be all or nothing. It's not going to be all COVID all the time. There's not enough resources for everything else. I think the priorities are going to be reset or certainly reviewed. I think even before this, though, by the way, that we're already headed in that direction. Just go back 12 months, 6 months. Well, let's make it 12. The COVID wasn't an issue, but increasingly we were seeing industry direct itself more and more to certain therapeutic categories where there's greater return. And so, I mean, it's just part of financial thinking. I think COVID just forces them to calibrate more so than ever before.
Are there any particular categories that you see especially endangered right now of getting attention that they should get?
Well, it depends upon how much are we going to see a lot more in cardiovascular? Alzheimer's is huge demand, but high risk, high reward, as the cliche goes. How much more effort and in dollars should, will be shoveled that way? I mean, I could see, more hard choices being made about some of the riskier situations as opposed to the safer bets. But look, I don't run a drug company. So when I do talk to people in those companies, it depends upon each company. They have slightly different product emphasis and experiences going in and out of certain categories. I'm not giving a lot of specific disease states here because I'm not really sure exactly which ones are going to suffer the most right now, but I think some of them are obvious. They already started. Diabetes, I mentioned cardiovascular. Oncology, it's a safe bet. Gene therapies, if we can work out reimbursement, that's a safe bet because the payoff is potentially so great. That's not a disease state, but it's a mechanism that takes us in a certain direction away from, pills that you get at the counter.
Let me ask you a question from Mark Lambrecht, who's asking, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on digitizing, modernizing, and speeding up the pharmaceutical value chain? Can analytics and decentralized hybrid processes with patients remotely monitored help to drive better medicines and more accessible healthcare? I guess he's saying, are there certain advantages with technology and AI and what we're seeing sped up because of COVID that would help the value chain in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole experience is teaching us that we can do more remotely. We can do more digitally because we just have to. I think we're seeing more emphasis on remote clinical trials. Although if you drill down a bit, I suppose that's easier said for later stage trials than the early stage trials where safety is such an issue. But still, we're headed in that direction already as a result. I think telemedicine is part of this too. I mean, he didn't really ask about marketing, but the fact that more people are going to be willing to change the way they interact with their healthcare providers will also change perhaps the way that medicines are prescribed. But the broad answer to his question is, yeah, it's going to change things because let's say we don't have a vaccine in September, October, or next January, or we do, but it's not effective in the way we hope, and we don't have enough of it fast enough. Well, what does that mean? That means we're going to be coming up with we're going to be increasingly reliant on working digitally and coming up with new processes, whether it's AI or just old-fashioned, sweat of the brow, come up with new ways of doing all this stuff. We have no choice is the short answer. So if we can use those tools, we should use them.
Let me ask you a question from Aaron Fox, who's asking for your long-term view of the industry. What have been the biggest changes toward improving transparency? You talked a little about the need for transparency earlier.
My long-term view about the need
Of the industry, and what have been the biggest changes? I guess she's asking what progress has been made and needs to be made toward improving transparency.
Well, transparency is all about disclosure, and I understand that there are trade secrets and competitive concerns, and they call it commercial confidentiality, whether it's a contract or anything else. But I mentioned patents before, and the work that was or wasn't done in discovering early stage discovery. Shortages come up. After the hurricane a few years ago, I forget the name of the hurricane, that we had, as a result, shortages of a lot of drugs needed by hospitals. A lot of the plants are in Puerto Rico, and suddenly we're short on, drugs that have been around for a long time. These aren't fancy specialty medicines that, were suddenly devised and cost a ton, but we had a shortage nonetheless. And for a while after that, it wasn't clear how long we were going to have a shortage, what was being done to mitigate it, what was being told to FDA. That's a wonky inside baseball example, but it does speak to frustrations that erode integrity and credibility. And yeah, they're commercial competitive concerns, but well, okay. But what about your public health mission? What about your responsibility to customers? Tell folks, tell regulators. So that's a problem that wasn't really resolved. And there's still fights about the idea of disclosing costs for a medicine. And whenever a state lawmaker proposes a bill, which has happened already several times around the country, there's pushback and countersuits. They've got to defend their turf. I get that. I mean, that's, again, I talk to relatives in pharma. I get an earful because they're taking an opportunity to say, oh, I got this guy in the media here who writes about this stuff, and, it's forgetting the relation. I hear it, but it's useful.
Do you hear from your relatives saying, why are you so hard on these people? Or do they say you're doing great work? What do you hear from them? What's the feedback?
I'm in that category where you know how people say you can choose your friends, but not your family.
Right.
No, basically, guys, I've been doing this long enough, except for the occasional antagonistic personality. Most people, I have really useful conversations with people because they know stuff I don't, and I'm genuinely curious. And they're genuinely curious why I write what I do or why I choose to look at the things I do. So, I always aim for a meeting of the minds because I want to keep dialogue going.
Right. And do you feel as challenged, or you talk about your curiosity, as you were 20 years ago in covering this? I mean, suddenly the story has taken such a big turn for the whole world. And what has that been like for you to cover, pharma in the era of COVID?
It's been pretty intense. It seemed to be accelerating already thanks to pricing over the last several years, but now it's taken on a whole new dimension because it's put into relief just how much we do need legitimately valid science that can be funded and used to develop what we really need, a medicine to keep us alive or a vaccine, whatever it is. So I think it's really, for me, underscored that yin and yang, as I called it earlier, the tension between what we need, what we want, how do we get there? That's made it philosophically, existentially, a more intense proposition. And I think while any one story may not convey that, that's how I'm thinking about it most of the time, unless the story has nothing to do with it. It could be a different topic. But I think it's made it more urgent, more dramatic, and more important.
And a quick question about you. Do you think you're a better reporter then this is probably better for a journalism seminar, but since I'm an editor, I have to ask this. Do you think you're a better reporter now than you were 10, 15 years ago? Or just different? Because I thought when I covered politics for a long time, and I thought I'm better as I get older because I feel more confident in what I know and don't know. But I don't know if that applies to you or not.
To an extent, you know, I use that cliche sometimes, you know, the more I know, the less I know, just because there's just so much. I mean, pharma is complicated intersection of science and policy and health and finance. There's a lot to learn, a lot to keep track of. So it's almost easy to forget more than you learn in a given day. But in terms of specifically being a better reporter, I think over time, like anything else, you learn to identify the dots that need to be connected. I mean, look, we all have our days. Sometimes you overlook a dot. I tried.
We're about out of time. Let me just get to two more, because there's so many questions. I want to get two more. Keith Richter has an interesting question. If a vaccine produced by a European or Chinese company is available before a US vaccine, do you see we could become near the back of the line, giving our antagonism of overseas allies?
Sure. China really wants to leverage every strength it has, whether it's vaccines or soybeans, to get what it wants. And there's a long list. There's dominance in the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all the investments it's made quietly in other countries around the world. It wants to be the economic powerhouse. It wants to woo people publicly. It wants to silence knowledge, not just criticism of things it doesn't want people to know. And I could see China manipulating a vaccine to get whatever it wants out of the United States. And they buy a lot of government bonds. So there's another concern.
And let me just get one. Here's one from David Lepre that looks like a good forward-looking one to end this session. Is we will at some point move past our current COVID world. What do you see as the most significant and sustained impacts on the industry post-COVID? Obviously, from what we're going through now.
That's a good question.
I mean, you talked about technology.
Yeah, I think it's the investment. One, it's investment in technology and resources in general. Technology is obviously high on the list, but I think it's going to be priorities, where the investments are made, what the mission is. It might force what some call a rethink about where they need to direct themselves, and not just in terms of which disease states to satisfy Wall Street, but where should they perhaps really focus their effort? Because I don't care if you're Warren Buffett or a homeless person in some panhandle, you're equally susceptible to a virus of this sort. And we also don't know if there'll be another virus just like this around the corner. And I think that's the motivator for the industry. How does it not just deal with today and tomorrow, but how does it anticipate something just like this in 2 or 3 years, to pick a not too far in a distant number? Will the industry be positioned properly with the resources to handle this and handle it correctly, so it can have the right science when we need it, and also the right distribution and the right approach toward dealing with solving the problem? The industry wants a lot of credit for doing a lot of good. Well, the opportunity is knocking on the door.
Ed, thank you. And I feel sad that there's so many more good questions that we just can't get to. If we had another hour or two, but you want them to keep coming back for more. So we'll have to do this again and get to some of these other smart questions. I do have a 30-second question that I have to ask you. Your religious readers know, people who read you religiously know not just about your mascot, but about your coffee habits that you talk about every morning. What's your latest recommendation for coffee?
This week I've been on maple bourbon.
On what?
Maple bourbon.
Oh, well, I'm glad you moved on from the donut. What was the donut coffee you were?
Glazed donut.
Yeah, that just feels wrong. So I'm glad you've moved on from that.
Well, for the really adventurous, you can buy Jack Daniels. Distillery in Tennessee sells a little tin, and I think you have to go online to get it.
With actual alcohol in it.
I have to double check them.
Well, anyway, Ed, thank you for a great conversation. And what was interesting too is just hearing about how you do your job, because I think it sort of opens my eyes a lot. And these questions were terrific. As I said, I apologize for not getting to more of them. I just want to remind everyone that we'll be hosting Stat Plus Conversations once again next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Be sure to sign up for Stats Chat next week when Matt Herper will be joined by Daniel Skovronsky, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer at Eli Lilly. They'll talk about the company's progress in developing an antibody drug against COVID-19, and we'll again be taking your questions live over Zoom. We hope you'll join us then. Thanks, Ed, again. Thanks, Mr. Pharmalot. Thanks to your mascot, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rick.